In the spring of 1941, the island of Malta was not a fortress. It was a wound. A tiny, limestone rock in the center of the Mediterranean, bombed daily into dust and rubble, its people clinging to life in caves, its defenders operating on a fraying thread of courage and dwindling supplies. The Axis called it the unsinkable aircraft carrier. For the British, it was becoming a tomb. And in a dim, sandbagged briefing hut on that besieged island, a young Royal Air Force pilot named Kenneth Campbell laid a finger on a grainy reconnaissance photograph and proposed an act of aviation that bordered on suicide. He was met not with awe, but with disbelief. With weary, cynical laughter from men who had seen too much death to believe in miracles. They called it preposterous. A fantasy. An upside-down bombing run inside a fortified harbor. A torpedo attack from the one direction the enemy thought impossible. They mocked him. But before the next dawn, 2 Italian heavy cruisers, the pride of Mussolini's fleet, would be shattered, burning, and settling into the mud of Tripoli harbor. And the name they laughed at would be whispered with reverence, a testament to the moment when sheer, unthinkable audacity changed the course of a naval campaign. This is not just the story of a raid. This is the story of how Kenneth Campbell, facing the most formidable harbor defenses in the Mediterranean, rewrote the rules of aerial combat in the span of 90 seconds. To understand the desperation of Campbell's plan, one must first feel the stranglehold tightening around Malta in early 1941. Since Italy's entry into the war, the island had become the critical pivot point in the battle for the Mediterranean. From its battered airfields at Lucca, Halfar, and Tokli, a handful of RAF and Fleet Air Arm aircraft, Hawker Hurricanes, Fairey Swordfish, and the newer Bristol Beaufort torpedo bombers, waged a relentless, unequal war against the Axis supply convoys fueling General Rommel's Afrika Korps in North Africa. But Malta itself was starving. Axis bombers based in Sicily, the Italian Regia Aeronautica, and the German Luftwaffe's Fliegerkorps X, pounded the island in a round-the-clock blitz. Food, fuel, and spare parts were measured in days, not weeks. Every aircraft lost was a catastrophe. Every pilot lost was irreplaceable. The men of RAF Malta existed in a state of permanent exhaustion, flying multiple sorties a day, sleeping in caves, their world reduced to the cockpit, the gun sight, and the next meal. The greatest threat to their survival came not from the air, but from the sea. The Italian Regia Marina dominated the central Mediterranean. Fast, modern cruisers and destroyers sortied from ports like Taranto, Messina, and most critically, Tripoli in Libya. They acted as both shields for Axis convoys and as deadly raiders, intercepting the precious British convoys from Gibraltar and Alexandria that were Malta's lifeline. Sink one of these capital ships, and you bought the island time. You saved thousands of tons of cargo. You altered the balance of power. In early April 1941, Allied intelligence delivered a bombshell. Fresh reconnaissance photos, taken at great risk by a Maryland reconnaissance plane of the RAF's No. 69 Squadron, revealed that the Italians had moved a powerful naval squadron into the heavily fortified main harbor at Tripoli. The images showed the distinctive silhouettes of 2 Condottieri-class light cruisers, the Giovanni del Bannier and her sister ship, the Bartolomeo Colleoni. Sleek, 5,000-ton warships capable of 37 knots, each armed with 8 6-inch guns and multiple torpedo tubes. They were hunters, designed to outrun anything they could not outgun. Their presence in Tripoli was a direct threat to Operation Tiger, a critical convoy carrying over 200 tanks for the beleaguered British forces in Egypt. If these cruisers put to sea, the convoy was doomed. Malta would be next. The order came down from the Admiralty in London, relayed through the besieged headquarters in Valletta, neutralized the threat. The mission fell to the men of No. 22 Squadron, RAF Coastal Command, recently deployed to Malta. Their weapon was the Bristol Beaufort Mki, a sturdy, twin-engine torpedo bomber. It was not a glamorous aircraft. Underpowered, with a complex and temperamental hydraulic system, it demanded skill and patience from its 4-man crew: pilot, observer/navigator, wireless operator/air gunner, and rear gunner. Its doctrine was straightforward: approach a target ship at low level, in a straight and steady run, and release the 18-inch Mk WW12 aerial torpedo at a range of about 1,000 yards. It was a job that required ice-cool nerves, as the aircraft had to fly straight into the teeth of a ship's defensive fire for the final, deadly approach. And Tripoli Harbor was the very definition of a hardened target. It was not an open roadstead. It was a fortress, a complex of inner basins protected by a massive, L-shaped main breakwater and a network of subsidiary moles. The entrance channel was narrow, pointed directly north, and covered by overlapping fields of fire from coastal artillery batteries mounting 152 mm and 120 mm guns. The inner harbor itself was a forest of anti-aircraft positions, batteries of 100 mm and 90 mm dual-purpose guns, dozens of 37 mm and 20 mm rapid-fire cannons, and webs of searchlights. The Italians, having learned from the British raid on Taranto, had also likely deployed anti-torpedo nets. To the seasoned commanders studying the photos in the Malta operations room, an attack looked like a statistical certainty of death. A Beaufort would have to run the gauntlet of the entrance, survive the gauntlet inside, and then make a perfect torpedo drop, all while flying at 50 feet in a predictable straight line. The odds of even reaching the release point were near zero. The odds of surviving the escape were non-existent. It was at this moment of grim calculus that a quiet, 23-year-old flying officer from Saltcoats, Scotland, spoke up. His name was Kenneth Campbell. The briefing for the selected Beaufort crews was held in a battered Nissan hut at Lucca Airfield. The air was thick with dust and the smell of cordite from the morning's raid. Maps of Tripoli Harbor were pinned to a board, the defensive positions marked in red grease pencil. The mood was somber. These men were not strangers to danger, but they were professionals. They could read a map and understand kill zones. The squadron commander outlined the problem. The standard attack profile was suicide. The harbor entrance was a death funnel. The cruisers were berthed in the inner basin, surrounded by quays and other shipping, making a clean torpedo run almost impossible. The mission, as traditionally conceived, was a butcher's bill waiting to be paid. Then Kenneth Campbell asked to see the photographs again. He was not a flamboyant character. He was known as a meticulous pilot, thorough in his planning, steady under pressure. He studied the images, not just of the cruisers, but of the harbor's topography. His eyes traced the line of the main breakwater, the angles of the quays, the shadowy space behind where the cruisers were moored. And he saw it. A seam in the armor. He pointed it out. The Italian defenses were designed to obliterate an attacker coming from the sea, through the main channel. Every gun, every searchlight, was oriented north, out to sea. But the cruisers were moored parallel to the southern quay, their sterns facing the inner wall of the harbor, their bows pointing towards the entrance. Their entire aft sector, a cruiser's most vulnerable angle for a torpedo hit, was presented not to the sea, but to the landward side of the harbor. "We don't go in through the front door," Campbell said, his voice calm. "We come in from the land. From the south. We clear the city and the outer defenses, then drop down behind the breakwater, inside the harbor itself." A murmur went through the room. It was tactically unorthodox, but not yet insane. Then he continued. "To get the correct drop angle on their sterns from that position, we'd have to be almost directly over them. The torpedo needs a water run, so we'd have to dive in." "Dive a Beaufort?" someone muttered. The Beaufort was a level bomber, a low-altitude truck. It was not built for dive-bombing maneuvers. "Not just a dive," Campbell said, his finger tracing an arc in the air. "A steep descent. And to get the nose down far enough, from that low altitude, to aim properly," he paused. "We'd have to roll inverted to achieve the attitude." Silence. Then the room erupted. Inverted? In a fully loaded Beaufort, at night, under heavy fire, inside a concrete canyon? It was a maneuver that violated every principle of torpedo bombing. The aircraft systems weren't designed for it. The torpedo release mechanism might not function. The strain could tear the wings off. The pilots, already exhausted and strained, could black out from the negative G-forces. The objections were technical, practical, and visceral. "You'll rip the wings off. The torpedo will hang up. You'll lose control and plow straight into the water. It's madness, Campbell." But Campbell stood his ground. He argued from geometry and surprise. The Italians would never expect an attack from inside their own fortress, from the city side. All their attention would be seaward. The inverted dive would be brief, a violent adjustment of attitude lasting only seconds, just enough to point the nose at the gap between the cruiser's stern and the quay. Roll upright, release the torpedo at minimum altitude, and then, the hardest part, try to claw their way out over the harbor wall and the waiting guns. It was a plan born of utter desperation and brilliant, frightening insight. It leveraged the enemy's greatest strength, their formidable fixed defenses, against them, by using those very defenses to create a perceptual blind spot. The squadron leadership was divided. The risk was monumental. The potential reward, crippling 2 cruisers, was war-altering. Kenneth Campbell volunteered to lead the attack. He did not order his crew. He would have taken any of them. But his regular team, Sergeant James Philip Scott observer, Sergeant Ralph William Hillman, wireless operator/air gunner, and Sergeant William John Mullis, rear gunner, stepped forward without hesitation. They knew the odds. They had flown with Campbell before. Their trust in his skill and his judgment was absolute. In the economy of life and death on Malta, that trust was the only currency that mattered. The mission was approved. 1 aircraft, 1 torpedo, for men against a harbor full of steel and fire. They were scheduled to take off at last light on April 6, 1941, to arrive over Tripoli under the cover of full darkness. As the Mediterranean sun dipped below the horizon, painting the limestone dust of Lucca blood red, Beaufort serial number N1016 was towed to its dispersal point. Ground crews, working with quiet efficiency, performed final checks. The 1,600-pound Mk-12 torpedo, its warhead packed with Torpex explosive, was slung beneath the fuselage. The aircraft looked heavy, ponderous, its lines utilitarian. It bore no special markings, just the standard RAF camouflage and the squadron codes. Campbell and his crew went through their rituals. Pre-flight checks were conducted with an almost sacramental focus. Every switch, every gauge, every control surface was verified. In the cramped cockpit and cabin, there was little talk beyond the necessary. Each man was locked in the prison of his own thoughts, steeling himself for the trial to come. They pulled on their life jackets and parachute harnesses, knowing full well that over a hostile harbor at 50 feet, neither would be of any use. At 19:15 hours, Campbell started the twin Bristol Taurus engines. The airframe shook with their deep-throated rumble. He gave a final thumbs up to the ground chief, released the brakes, and began the takeoff roll. The Beaufort, laden with fuel and its deadly cargo, climbed sluggishly into the gathering twilight, turning northeast towards the coast of Africa, 180 miles away. The flight was a trial of navigation and nerve. Sergeant Scott, in the observer's station, guided them using dead reckoning and occasional star fixes, keeping them low over the dark sea to avoid German radar plots from Pantelleria. The thrum of the engines was a constant drone. Below, the Mediterranean was a black void, indistinguishable from the sky except for the faint, ghostly phosphorescence in their wake. No navigation lights. Radio silence. They were a speck of sound and metal moving through an immense, hostile darkness. For over 2 hours, this was their world. The tension was not of immediate danger, but of anticipation. The slow, steady march towards a moment of explosive violence. Campbell's hands rested lightly on the controls, his eyes scanning the instruments and the blackness ahead. Hillman monitored the wireless, listening for any catastrophic change in orders that would never come. Mullis, in his rear-facing turret, scanned the empty sky behind them, knowing the first sign of trouble would likely be tracers. Then, a faint glow on the horizon. Not the soft glow of stars, but the hard, orange-yellow glow of electric lights. Tripoli. As they drew closer, the outline of the city and the harbor complex resolved itself against the night. From this approach, it looked deceptively peaceful. The rectangular shapes of the basins, the long, dark finger of the main breakwater. And there, nestled against the southern quay of the inner harbor, were the 2 long, lean shapes of the Italian cruisers, illuminated by working lights on the docks. They were huge. Campbell initiated the attack profile. He swung wide, coming in from the south-southwest, over the darkened Libyan coastline. The city sprawled beneath them. Now, every sense was screaming. The plan depended on absolute surprise for the first, critical seconds. They crossed the coastline at 500 feet. Searchlights, probing the sea approaches, were pointed away from them. The coastal batteries were silent. So far, the gamble on the axis of approach was holding. Campbell pushed the nose down. The Beaufort began its descent, racing now just above the rooftops of the city's outskirts, then the port facilities. The airspeed built. The harbor wall rushed towards them. This was the point of no return. Once they crossed that wall, they were in the cage. At the last possible second, Campbell hauled back on the yoke, clearing the stone parapet by mere feet. They were inside. And hell awoke. The sudden, violent transition from dark cityscape to the brilliantly lit, cavernous space of the inner harbor was disorienting. The cruisers loomed monstrously to their left. And in a heartbeat, the Italian defenses reacted. A searchlight beam, swinging wildly, locked onto them. Then another. The Beaufort was suddenly pinned in a cone of blinding white light. Claxons wailed. Muzzle flashes erupted from a dozen points around the basin as the 37mm and 20mm batteries opened up. Tracers, green, red, and white, converged on them in a lethal latticework. The sound was immediate and deafening. The hammering of cannon shells, the whump of heavier flak, the scream of the engines at full throttle. Campbell had seconds. The plan was unraveling into chaos. He was too high, too fast, and the angle to the leading cruiser's stern was wrong. The torpedo run was impossible. To try it would send the weapon harmlessly into the quay. It was now or never. The moment for the unthinkable. Hang on, Campbell shouted into the intercom, his voice swallowed by the roar. He banked the Beaufort sharply to the left, away from the most concentrated fire, lining up for a pass directly down the length of the harbor, parallel to the quay. Tracers streamed past the canopy like furious insects. A shell struck the port wing root with a sickening crump, but the aircraft held. His mind, trained to a razor's edge, calculated. They had one pass. One chance to create the geometry he had envisioned on the map. He needed to be lower. He needed the nose pointed down at an extreme angle. And there was only one way to do it from this altitude inside the concrete canyon. He pulled the yoke back hard. The Beaufort's nose rose sharply. The G-forces pressed the crew down into their seats. The horizon dropped away. They were in a steep, climbing turn, the harbor lights whirling below them. Italian gunners, confused by the maneuver, struggled to track them. Then, at the apex of the climb, as the aircraft began to shudder on the edge of a stall, Campbell kicked left rudder and pushed the yoke forward to the left. The world inverted. The Beaufort rolled onto its back. For the crew, it was a moment of surreal, terrifying disorientation. The black water of the harbor was suddenly above them. The lit decks of the cruisers were below their heads. They hung in their harnesses. Loose equipment clattered against the cabin roof. The aircraft groaned in protest. Airframe stresses it was never designed to handle screaming through its structure. Campbell, fighting the controls, held the inverted attitude. He was not flying now. He was falling in a controlled, inverted dive. His eyes were fixed through the top of the canopy at the stern of the Giovanni del Bannier, which was now rushing up to meet them. He adjusted with minute movements of the ailerons and rudder. 2 seconds. 3. The altimeter unwound at a terrifying rate. 200 feet. 150, 100. Now, he yelled, more to himself than anyone. He reversed the controls, rolling the heavy bomber back to level flight. The positive G-force of the recovery was crushing. But he was where he needed to be, horrifically low, directly astern of the cruiser, perfectly aligned. The massive hull filled his windscreen, so close he could see the rivets, the faces of Italian sailors staring over the rail in shock. He stabilized the aircraft, holding it rock steady despite the maelstrom of fire. The torpedo release parameters were met. At a distance of barely 400 yards, point-blank range for an aerial torpedo, his thumb pressed the release button on the yoke. A thud shuddered through the airframe as the torpedo dropped away. It hit the water with a splash, righted itself, and began its run, its engine igniting to leave a bubbling trail straight for the cruiser's exposed stern. On the bridge of the Giovanni del Bannier, the warning came too late. The ship's engines roared as the captain ordered emergency ahead, trying to swing the stern away, but a harbor is not the open sea. There was no room. The torpedo struck just forward of the rudder post. The explosion was a cataclysm of sound and light within the confined space of the harbor. A column of water, flame, and debris erupted high into the night air. The cruiser jerked violently, as if kicked by a giant. The blast tore open the after hull plates, flooding engineering spaces instantly and severing the steering gear. Lights flickered and died across her aft section. A fierce fire took hold, fed by ruptured fuel lines. The ship began to list to port, her fighting capability extinguished in a single, shattering blow. But for Campbell and his crew, there was no time to witness their success. The entire wrath of the harbor's defense was now focused solely on them. The Beaufort, having pulled up from its death-defying dive, was now a slow, lumbering target trying to gain altitude over the eastern edge of the harbor. A concentrated barrage of 20 millimeters fire ripped into the aircraft. The port engine, already damaged, erupted in flames. Hydraulic fluid sprayed across the cockpit canopy. The controls went sloppy, then unresponsive. Sergeant Hillman reported the wireless was shattered. Sergeant Mullis, from his turret, cried out that the starboard aileron was gone. Campbell fought the dying aircraft, trying to will it over the breakwater. For a few agonizing seconds, it seemed he might make it. They cleared the stone wall, the dark, open sea beckoning just beyond. Then a final, accurate burst from a 37 millimeters battery found them. It severed a main spar in the tail. The Beaufort's nose dropped. It was over. With no control, no power, and a wall of tracer fires still pursuing them, Beaufort N-1016 slammed into the Mediterranean just a few hundred yards outside the harbor mole. It cartwheeled once on impact and sank almost immediately into the deep water. There were no parachutes, no survivors. Kenneth Campbell, James Scott, Ralph Hillman, and William Mullis were gone. In the chaotic aftermath, the Italians rushed to aid the stricken Giovanni del Band. The damage was severe. The cruiser was towed to a berth, where she settled into the harbor mud, a burnt-out, flooded wreck. She would be under repair for over a year, missing critical access operations during the summer and fall of 1941. Her sister ship, Bartolomeo Colleoni, had not been attacked, but the shock of the raid and the demonstrated vulnerability within their own strongest port had a profound psychological effect. Italian naval operations from Tripoli were severely curtailed, their commanders now fearful of the skies even inside their fortified anchors. The immediate strategic impact was tangible. The threat to Operation Tiger was removed. The convoy, carrying its vital cargo of tanks, passed through the Mediterranean without interference from surface raiders. Those tanks would soon see action, helping to blunt Rommel's first offensive in North Africa. The flow of supplies to Malta, while never easy, faced one less potent enemy. Back in Malta and London, the truth of what happened emerged slowly. Intelligence pieced together the story from Italian radio intercepts, agent reports, and the simple fact that a major cruiser was out of action. The audacity of the attack stunned Allied commanders. They understood that a single Beaufort, through a combination of navigational brilliance, piloting skill of the highest order, and sheer, breathtaking courage, had achieved what an entire squadron might have failed to do. For a year, the full details remained unknown, the crew listed as missing. But the evidence of their success mounted. Finally, on March 13, 1942, the London Gazette announced the posthumous award of the Victoria Cross to Flying Officer Kenneth Campbell. The citation detailed the valor and devotion to duty unsurpassed in the annals of the Royal Air Force. It spoke of the brilliantly conceived and executed attack against impossible odds. Sergeants Scott, Hillman, and Mullis were mentioned in dispatches for their gallantry. Kenneth Campbell's VC is unique. It is one of the few awarded for an action where no official eyewitness from the attacking force survived to tell the tale. It is based entirely on the irrefutable result and the deduced magnitude of the courage required to achieve it. His inverted bombing run entered RAF legend, a topic of awe and study in training schools. It proved that even in an age of increasing technological warfare, the human element, courage, ingenuity, and the will to press and attack home at all costs remained the decisive factor. The wrecks of the Beaufort and the damaged cruiser are long gone, swallowed by time and the sea. But the legacy endures. It is a story of how four men, flying a machine deemed inadequate for the task, looked at a problem declared impossible and found an answer written not in the manual, but in the limits of their own courage. They silenced the laughter with the roar of an explosion that echoed through the war at sea. The story of Kenneth Campbell's upside-down run is a stark testament to the fact that in war, the rules are written by those willing to defy them. It is a lesson in perception, in seeing the path everyone else has missed, and having the fortitude to fly it straight into the teeth of hell. This was just one of countless untold stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to World War II Records Maker as we continue to bring these forgotten chapters of history back to life.